Scarcely a week goes by without reference to the violence and bloodshed in El Salvador. The epidemic of revolution has spread from Nicaragua to that country and threatens to pass to Guatemala and perhaps later to Honduras. Why are these volcanoes erupting now? Common to these areas is the Latin American inequality syndrome. In the case of the Nicaraguan revolt, it was a struggle against the almost medieval stranglehold of one family, the Somosas, over the entire country. Appointed president after the U.S. withdrew from its military occupation of Nicaragua in 1932, Anastasio Somoza, followed by his eldest son Luis and then Anastasio Jr., ruled his country with an iron hand for more than 40 years. There was also an Anastasio III waiting in the wings for his father to retire. Opposition was brutally suppressed. The liberal leader Sandino, after whom the Sandinistas were named, was once invited by Somoza Sr. to come and talk things over. En route, he was brutally murdered. It's been like that ever since in Nicaragua until 1979. The social situation in Somoza's Nicaragua mirrored that of both Guatemala and El Salvador. On the one hand was the elite, consisting essentially of the Somoza family and hangers-on. In addition to extensive investments abroad, they owned an estimated 2/3 of all arable land in Nicaragua. The largest cattle herds, the construction industry, the national airline Lanica, gold mines, coffee plantations, most of the nation's communications network, the merchant navy, several foreign franchises, and the famous Intercontinental Hotel. In all, about 40% of the national economy. The Somoza's wealth is estimated as high as $1.5 billion, including the vast real estate holdings in Miami, the Caribbean, Paraguay, and Switzerland. In short, Somoza and family were fabulously wealthy. All were educated at U.S. colleges. The son of the deposed president went to Harvard and his father to West Point, and were proud of their family role as U.S. proconsul in Central America. On the other hand were the have-nots, in actual fact the vast majority of the population. Schooling and healthcare were of course luxuries for these people. Almost 60% of the population was illiterate, and only 1 in 10 children ever got to start secondary school. Average life expectancy was 50 years of age, and malnutrition is estimated to affect some 50% of all children over 5. Unemployment figures hovered around 30 to 50%, with large numbers also underemployed, largely because of their seasonal employment. As if this weren't bad enough, the housing situation was quite appalling. 61% of all houses had no drinking water, 77% no electricity, and fully 1 in every 3 dwellings was just a one-room shack. The inevitable comparisons between the contrasting lifestyles of the haves and have-nots helped to fuel an understandable resentment. Moreover, since this situation had not improved for the masses in more than 4 decades, they were understandably frustrated. During the 40 years of the Somoza dynasty, time stood still. Somoza Sr. believed in showing a firm hand in protecting freedom, supporting the anti-communist struggle, and of course looking after his own wealth at the same time. Yet the concept of this so-called freedom was a subjective one, since freedom of the press was not observed. He once noted, and I quote, "It is vital not to disturb the order reigning in the country," unquote. After his assassination in 1956, his two sons continued these family traditions, in much the same way as mafia leaders protect their own criminal interests. Two unrelated events changed all that. One was the December 1972 earthquake in the nation's capital, Managua, and the other was the assassination in January 1978 of the outspoken newspaper editor Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. Despite awards of more than $100 million from around the world to help in the reconstruction of the devastated capital, virtually nothing was accomplished. Somoza and his followers, ably supported by his own goon squad, the infamous National Guard, simply pocketed the foreign aid. Indeed, almost a decade later, Managua's city core looks more like a moon crater than a capital. The killing of Chamorro, a much-respected political leader, acted as a catalyst to the widely felt frustration. Church, business, and middle-class sectors all bitterly attacked Somoza. A third crucial factor was the cold-blooded and callous murder of ABC newsman Bill Stewart by a National Guardsman as the American reporter lay at his feet. This act of brutality, witnessed in millions of North American living rooms, brought floods of protest. When Jimmy Carter, after complaining repeatedly about the deterioration of human rights in Nicaragua, dumped Somoza, it was all over. By the time Somoza fled by private jet to Miami, his elite National Guard had killed 40,000 and left 500,000 homeless in their orgy of violence. And this in a country of just under 2.5 million, or 1 in 5 homeless and 1 in 60 killed. The Sandinistas had won, but their problems were just beginning. Such was the bitter legacy of Somoza, the last Marine as he was called because of his role as proconsul of U.S. interests in Central America. When other Central American strongmen learned what was the fate of their former companion in arms, panic swiftly spread. The domino theory, according to which revolution would spread to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and to the last domino, the United States, caused an understandable fear. A similar scene to this brutality is being played out both in Guatemala and in El Salvador.
Por las calles viene un canto anunciando amanecida.
Al asalto, compañeros, vamos muchachos, vamos para arriba. Al asalto, compañeros, vamos muchachos, vamos para arriba. Fortalecer la unidad garantiza la victoria de un pueblo que se levanta junto a la clase.
Indeed, if left alone by external forces, both would undoubtedly follow a similar route to that of Nicaragua. It will come as no surprise that the same sad litany of pathetic living conditions and repression can be seen in Guatemala. Amnesty International, the worldwide organization which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize just a few years ago, claims that at least 5,000 people were assassinated in 1980, almost all by the security forces or right-wing death squads. 30 of those were peasants killed during a peaceful occupation of the Spanish embassy in Guatemala City, called to publicize their miserable living conditions. Despite pleas from the ambassador, the security forces attacked the embassy, killing the peasants and some 14 employees. There was one survivor. He was kidnapped the following day from his hospital bed. His badly tortured body was found a few hours later. But while the peasants are the most frequent target of the security forces, no sector is totally safe. Documented evidence has been gathered to show that more than 100 professors and students at Guatemala City's Universidad de San Carlos, several priests and lawyers, and 13 journalists were all assassinated in 1980 alone. A further 3 journalists disappeared from police custody. Their crime? Daring to help the unfortunates who make up the vast majority of this area, or in the case of the journalists, for telling the truth. Living conditions in Guatemala are very similar to those in Nicaragua under the Somozas. Housing conditions are simply atrocious. 70% of the population earns less than $100 a year. Life expectancy in the cities is 56 years, and in the country, 41. 1 in every 10 children die within the first year of life, and a staggering 81% of the survivors suffer from malnutrition. 2 out of every 3 Guatemalans over the age of 7 are illiterate. Another disturbing statistic: since 1966, Amnesty International claims that at least 20,000 have been assassinated by the death squads. All these figures, by the way, come from an excellent series of articles published in the October 19 issue of the United Church Observer, entitled "The Heroic Church in Central America." Let's try and relate that to the situation here in Canada. Can you imagine 70% of the population living on less than $100 a year, or living in shacks such as the ones we've been seeing, or rural Canadians living an average of only 41 years? How can any responsible parent react to seeing 4 out of every 5 children malnourished? Do you think this is sufficient motive for revolution? Both in El Salvador and in Guatemala, it's basically the same struggle that's being fought. To quote the excellent May 1981 issue of the newsletter of the Interchurch Committee on Human Rights in Latin America, it pits the majority of the people and a small, immensely privileged group who apparently are willing to go to any lengths to retain their wealth and power. This elite, aided by a military clique, runs the country to their own advantage and brutally represses all attempts at reform. Those seeking any changes are branded as communists and subversives and are duly assassinated. The government, headed by General Lucas Garcia, has been condemned by most church bodies and by the UN Commission on Human Rights, a resolution incidentally co-sponsored by Canada. But little has changed in Guatemala. Indeed, despite President Carter's decision to cut off all military aid in 1977 to protest continuous human rights violations, it looks as if under Ronald Reagan, the pendulum is very quickly swinging back in the military's favor. We can therefore expect to see, as in El Salvador and Honduras, massive infusions of US military aid to Guatemala within the next year. We can also expect the daily body count, currently just under 30 political assassinations a day, to increase substantially. Perhaps nowhere is this short-sighted and many would say hypocritical stance of the US government seen more clearly than in El Salvador. What is happening there is best described by Hugh McCollum of the United Church Observer. He said, "The popular wisdom about this overpopulated little country is that a moderate, reform-minded civilian military junta is caught between extremists of the left and right. Nothing could be further from the truth. The United States is currently fond of this deception as it desperately tries to prop up a regime which has no base in popular support and whose record of violence exceeds the worst of the dictatorship it overthrew a year ago." Many Canadians might be excused for thinking incorrectly that the troubles in El Salvador only started in the past year or so. After all, it was then that Nicaragua had her revolution, and Cuba seems to have been sniffing around Central America since then. But this too is part of the misinformation that we've been given. In actual fact, the roots of this present rebellion date back 50 years to 1932, when a rising of landless and unemployed peasants, much like those fighting now, was brutally repressed. Within a month, 31,000 were killed, and this in a country half the size of Nova Scotia. A piece of trivia: those who accuse Fidel Castro of having dreams of continental grandeur should note he was 6 years old at the time. The causes for this uprising and the renewed revolutionary activity are basically the same: the pathetic social conditions in which most Salvadorians today live. A few lowlights. Annual per capita income is about $350. While more than 60% of the population works in the countryside, very few own the land. 2% of the population own 60% of the arable land, on which export crops are mostly grown. El Salvador has the lowest caloric intake of all of Latin America. As a result, 73% of all children suffer from malnutrition. The unemployment rate is, according to official figures, 50%. About 60% of the population is illiterate, and 1 in 3 families live in one-room shacks. Almost 2 out of every 3 people lack running water. These atrocious figures in themselves are probably more than sufficient for the 1932 revolt. After all, as was noted in the first program, since the vast majority of Latin Americans have absolutely nothing to look forward to, they therefore have nothing to lose by engaging in the revolutionary struggle. Another important factor in the Salvadoran Revolution is the popular reaction to the role of the military, who have been running the country for the last 50 years, defrauding electoral returns, intervening when the opposition candidate in the farcical elections won, and simply assassinating all those who disagreed. In October 1979, it looked for a couple of months as if all that had changed. Since there have been several juntas since then, it's interesting to compare just how this revolution has evolved. An unusual coup took place in October 79. Two colonels, Gutierrez and Majano, took over, promising respect for the country's constitution, massive land reform, recognition of Cuba, sweeping social change, nationalization of many foreign-owned companies. It looked too good to be true, and it was. 3 months later, the government was in tatters. The civilian junta members resigned, as did 10 of the 11 cabinet ministers and all 13 deputy ministers. 1981, Colonel Majano himself was arrested. The causes for the mass resignation? Virtually nothing had been done about the promised reforms, and indeed the degree of government repression had actually increased. One of the civilian members of the former junta, Guillermo Ungo, the leader of the Social Democrats, became the leader of the FDR, the opposition, the Frente Democrático Revolucionario, taking with him almost all of his party and most of the Christian Democrats too. They were joined by most of the trade unions, mass organizations, peasant groups, student body, and large sectors of the church. The junta, now depleted, invited José Napoleón Duarte to lead the junta, although it's generally agreed his inclusion was merely for cosmetic surgery purposes. Real power still resided in the hands of the military hardliners. Since early January 1980, when the mass resignations took place, the degree of repression has gone from bad to worse in El Salvador. Some 22,000 people have been assassinated in the last 15 months, and there are already an estimated 500,000 refugees within the country. As the Council of Hemispheric Studies recently noted, more people have died during the past year, largely as a result of government-condoned right-wing death squad killings, than in all the other nations of Latin America combined. The legal department of the Archdiocese of San Salvador attributes a staggering 80% of these political assassinations to the National Army and police forces, and the rest to the death squads and paramilitary, all of which it claims, and I quote, function illegally under the protection of the National Security Forces and the Army.
Racimos de paz y de gorriones, una Holanda de mies desaromadas, California de melocotones, una Asia sin Corea ensangrentada, una Corea en flor, otra en botones, una América en frutos sazonada.
The degree of brutality shown by these people is truly stunning and clearly appears to have the effect of alienating large sectors of the population, in much the same way that the military abuses in pre-Castro Cuba and pre-Sandinista Nicaragua eventually tipped the balance in favor of the revolutionaries. Many North Americans, for example, remember the cold-blooded murder of ABC News reporter Bill Stewart. If the savage torturing and assassination of the 4 American religious workers in December 1980 by 6 soldiers had been televised, maybe the situation in El Salvador would be different now. The sadistic nature of the violence seems more in place in a Nazi concentration camp of 40 years ago. 2 examples from the United Church Observer. One day this spring in Santa Ana, security forces attacked a hospital allegedly being used to treat leftist guerrillas. They machine-gunned to death 3 doctors, 4 nurses and a baby. The excuse? The victims had resisted. In San Salvador, 2 journalists were kidnapped from a downtown restaurant one Friday evening. The next morning, their bodies were found, legs methodically chopped to pieces, disemboweled, burned with acid, limbs crushed. Their crime? They were editor and on the other a photographer of La Crónica, a small daily which had been critical of the junta. One of the reasons then for the continued revolt in El Salvador is to bring about a change in government, since the junta is clearly incompetent, to be kind, or unwilling to change Salvadoran society in the least. Given the role of the military in preventing the path of democracy as we know it, and indeed of brutally assassinating anybody who does not subscribe to their views, what other alternatives for the people are there? The case of the 4 American religious workers who were raped and tortured before being killed by 6 Salvadorian soldiers, and the assassination of Archbishop Romero while saying Mass helped to put the insane mentality of the Salvadorian military into its proper perspective. Perhaps, too, these incidents help to cast some light on the viability of using violence to fight fire with fire. The case of Archbishop Romero, Archbishop of the capital city, San Salvador, is interesting. Essentially a conservative man, he gradually became convinced, after comparing the fabulous wealth enjoyed by the elite with the misery of the vast majority, and after seeing the continuing military brutality, that these forces were totally immoral and unchristian. He appealed unsuccessfully to President Carter not to supply more military aid to his country. Beans, not bullets, were required. Faced with unrelenting pressure, he explained reluctantly how, when faced with the blatant disregard for life on the part of the junta, violence can indeed be justified, providing that all other advances have been explored, as was clearly the case in his country. He said, "We know that the majority of peasants, workers and shantytown dwellers who have organized themselves in order to promote their interests and bring about the structural changes are simply labeled terrorists and subversive. They are kidnapped, tortured and murdered without being able to count on the laws to protect them. Faced with this unequal and unjust situation, they've often been forced to defend themselves to the point of violence." On March 23, 1980, in his regular Sunday sermon, he urged the Salvadorian soldiers, in the name of God, to disobey orders and not kill any more peasants. The day after, he was assassinated while saying Mass. He joined the ranks of the 4 American missionaries and 11 priests who have all been assassinated during the last 4 years in El Salvador. 16 religious in a country 1/2 the size of Nova Scotia. What makes this loss of life all the more tragic is the attitude of the Reagan government to this tragic situation. Even after the assassination of the American nuns, his government claimed continued to pump in military aid to the tune of an additional $25 million. The justification for this? His ambassador to the United Nations, Jean Kirkpatrick, defended the Duarte government as an MRAG1, in her terms, mildly repressive authoritarian government. One would hate to see a wholly repressive government. President Reagan, for his part, showed a similar ignorance of what is happening, claiming in Newsweek that, and I quote, he was helping the forces that are supporting human rights in El Salvador against the attacks by left-wing terrorists. Throughout Latin America, the right-wing dictatorships are now lining up for military aid. Now, unfortunately, they're getting more than ever. What is discouraging about these crossed wires of the US government is that they continue, apparently deliberately blind to what is happening in El Salvador, and by extension, Latin America as a whole. The comment of Father Miguel Descoto, one of the 4 priests in the cabinet of the new Nicaraguan government, on the US phobia of communism is appropriate. Knowing how paranoid some Americans can be regarding the threat of communism, Somoza has astutely used anti-communism to extract help from the US, even if his regime is as totalitarian and entrenched as some communist regimes are. What can we learn from all this? Why is there revolution in Latin America? Our media will probably say that the communist involvement is the basic reason. Others will say that the church, which for 5.5 centuries, as one of the wealthiest landowners, threw its support wholeheartedly behind the status quo, has betrayed its traditional role. Many hold now that the new religious or Marxist and priest dress, as they're often referred to, are the reason for the rise in the peasant activity. This series has tried to show that there are more obvious reasons: government brutality, hunger, unemployment, chronic health, and land, as well as the intangibles such as the fight for dignity and social justice. The reaction to the official and legalized repression and the continuous abuse of power by the security forces cannot be underestimated. That is why Senor Samoya, Minister of Education in the October 1979 junta in El Salvador, eventually gave up his government post to join the guerrillas. We should also remember the lack of legal resources available to combat the extremes of militarism. We're talking about countries where might is right. Judge Atilio Ramirez, appointed to investigate the assassination of Archbishop Romero, found out just how powerless the law is. After discovering that 2 high-ranking military officials were responsible, including the former head of intelligence in the Salvadoran army, he fled to Costa Rica. Both he and Guatemalan Vice President Villagran Kramer, who fled to the United States, were afraid of this so-called doctrine of security. In both countries, to paraphrase the Guatemalan Vice President, there are no political prisoners, just political assassinations. Another fundamental reason for the question raised by the series is simply that it's a fight for survival, as it has been for Latin American masses during the last 400 years. It's the continuation of the struggle for social justice and reform initiated in 1810 by the Mexican priest Father Hidalgo. His land reform program, that of Zapata, Fidel Castro, and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, are all essentially the same. Pan y libertad, bread and freedom, the rallying cry in Mexico in 1910, resounds once again near the volcanoes of El Salvador. Similarly, the struggle to have a job, to enjoy decent education, to be able to see a doctor, to have something other than a shack to live in, to work one's land, to hold political or religious beliefs without harassment, and to aspire for something better for one's children. These are all as much a part of Latin America's struggle now as they were nearly 2 centuries ago. Would we really do otherwise ourselves? If all are, in theory, included within the fabulous document, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, why can't they in practice enjoy those rights? And when these rights are taken away from them, what are they supposed to do? Perhaps Archbishop Romero put it best: Christians are not afraid of combat. They prefer the language of peace. When a dictatorship seriously violates human rights and attacks the common good of the nation, when it becomes unbearable and it becomes impossible to have channels of dialogue, of understanding, then when this happens, the Church speaks of the legitimate right of the insurrectional violence.